if the president manages to create the conditions for the war to end, that will be an amazing thing, and he will have delivered on one of his key pledges. But it is very difficult, and we've yet to see him be able to move Putin in any way at all.
And that's time to chat WTF, the week that finished, and look back on a very busy news week with our esteemed panel of political big brains. Today, that is former Conservative Cabinet Minister Penny Mordaunt and former Labour frontbencher Jonathan Ashworth. Good afternoon to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
As I say, the news doesn't rest on Good Friday, and neither do we. So let's talk about the big story this week, which was the UK Supreme Court ruling that the legal definition of a woman should be based on biological sex. The judges ruled that when the term woman was used in the Equality Act, it means a biological woman, and sex means biological sex. The government's official response welcomed the ruling, but it didn't make Minister Karen Smythe's interview the following morning any easier when she tried to answer this from Times Radio's Callum MacDonald.
Female changing rooms should be used by women.
Right. And so where should a trans woman get changed?
And it's important that a trans woman or a trans man also has dignity in their use of public spaces. The use of public spaces is also a wider issue for all sorts of people who feel they don't have access to public spaces. We have a large debate on changing rooms for people who might be disabled, who need greater provision. So, if we have a debate about public spaces and particularly bathrooms, that means that is available for all, providing dignity for all people, then that would be a good thing. But the ruling is very clear.
Penny Mordaunt, you were former Equalities Minister. Do you agree with the Supreme Court ruling?
Yes, I think there's a great deal of positive that will come from this ruling. Largely in the public sector. I think the private sector has always managed to handle these issues really well and sensibly. It's elements of the public sector where you've had some crazy things going on. And successive ministers and campaigners have raised repeatedly concerns about particular services, and not much has happened. So I think this is really helpful in that respect.
But you've been on a bit of a journey yourself, haven't you? I mean, do you sort of openly acknowledge that? Because you were trying to make it easier for trans people to get gender recognition certificates to prove legally that they had changed their gender.
So we were looking at the process, but I think that you have to, this ruling is looking at a particular definition in the Equalities Act. And I think that is where the confusion has arisen from many of these public services. People want to ensure that everyone, including trans people, can go about their lives. And I think by and large, they have been able to do that. They've been able to go to the gym and swimming pools and usually change in a third place. If it's a small cafe, they know which loo to go to because there's only one. I think where difficulties will arise and people will be scratching their heads after this is in places where you've got like an old listed pub, and Gladys has been using the ladies for the last 10 years, and there's no possibility of putting in any additional facilities. So I think people will need a bit of guidance. But by and large, I think trans people will be carrying on as they have. And we should get some reform in things like the prison service, recording of crime, and also in sport.
But do you accept you've changed your mind on this issue?
No, I haven't. I think biologically, in terms of people's lived experience and as we've had this week in the definition of the Act, that always has been the case. There's been some debate about the latter, but the ruling this week puts that to bed. Socially, is it okay to refer to a trans person as a woman? Yes, of course. They're still recognised as a woman in particular legal documents and interactions with the state, but that doesn't entitle them to access single-sex spaces. So I welcome the clarity on that this week.
John Ashworth, can you do any better than the Minister did in that breakfast radio interview earlier this week? I mean, are you able to say whether a trans woman now has to use a men's changing room?
Well,
or a men's ward, for example?
I'm not going to attempt to, because the good people of Leicester South have given me the advantage of not having to attempt to answer those questions anymore as a frontline politician. But the question obviously brings into acute focus some of the dilemmas that people who provide services will now be faced with, which is, I think the ruling is the right ruling. I welcome it. It offers clarity. It offers the assurance to women who quite rightly should have access to single-sex spaces, something I've always believed in. But equally, we also know that trans people have been with us for a long time, way beyond this becoming a political controversy in the last sort of 5 or 6 years or so, deserve to be treated with respect, have protections in law when it comes to discrimination. But there will obviously service providers will now be looking for guidance, and I think the relevant equalities bodies will be updating their guidance. I sort of think in the end, though, as Penny was, I think, hinting at, I think a lot of these issues in a local area will be, or in a locality, whether it is a pub or a local leisure centre, will be resolved by common sense.
Yeah, but you've not been able to answer the question any more than the minister did, and I know you've sort of ducked out of it from a sort of political standpoint. But what does a nurse do on a ward where a trans woman wants to go on the female ward? Would you say, right, they have to go on the men's ward?
Well, I mean, my understanding of the ruling is that a women's ward now is for women. Now, actually, mixed sex wards have existed in the NHS. Forever, and
they're
sadly,
not supposed to, though, have they?
No, they're not supposed to. Successive governments have promised to stamp them out, but because of pressures in the NHS, have never been able to stamp them out.
So a trans woman would have to go on a men's ward then?
Well, I mean, a hospital would have to make appropriate arrangements. However, you've got to be also, but you've also got to be. We've got to be realistic. I mean, journalists quite rightly put these questions to politicians, and I don't complain about that. Politicians should be held to account. But they're always put to politicians in the sort of purist form, as if we're in a sort of philosophy seminar at university. In truth, at a local or in a locality, these things are worked out in a much more common sense approach. We have got mixed sex wards in hospitals. We shouldn't. Successive governments have promised to stamp them out, and I'm sure hospitals will be able to make the appropriate arrangements.
Penny, you said a little earlier that, socially, a trans woman is a woman. You have no problem with that. But, in the eyes of the law, a trans woman is not a woman. And we've just been discussing that with John about what that means on a sort of NHS ward, for example. Now, all of that is causing a lot of anguish to trans people. Do you recognise that people who were given rights by the state have really had them sort of repealed now, and that's very unfortunate?
So look, I think that most trans people they're very pragmatic. They're not campaigners or activists on this issue. They just want to go about and live their lives. There will still be in their driving licenses, their passports, for people who've been through a gender recognition process, they will still have their acquired gender in those documents. Those are legal documents, and with interactions with the state, like their national insurance contribution file and all those sorts of things, they'll have their new gender in that. What the ruling this week is really focused on is the Equalities Act, and this is really important because even if they've got those legal documents, they're not entitled to be considered to be a woman when using those particular services, whether it's women's refuges or prisons or hospital wards. So the question I think that needs to be really thought about is, what is the purpose of the gender recognition process, if that is the case? And many people want their new gender in those documents, and that's fair enough. So I think there will be further questions that people would need to have a think about after this.
Right.
But I do think overall it is a positive. I think the impact on trans people will be minimal. There might be those cases, like I mentioned, of a pub that people need to have a think about. But by and large, I think people will be able to go about their lives and access services, as has been done for many, many years. But I think the real difference here is that women can be assured that when they're at their most vulnerable, in a bathroom or in a hospital ward, they can feel comfortable and confident in that environment.
Right.
And that is really very important.
John, Labour got this very badly wrong, didn't it? Keir Starmer talking about some women having penises. I mean, it was bad, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, Labour at the last election got itself into a much more sensible position. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you go back sort of 5 or 6 years, I think 2019 Labour's manifesto was about self-ID, and Labour has shifted its position. And all of us who were Labour spokespeople throughout those 5 years, I was a regular on the morning rounds, as you know. Were always sort of slightly in dread of getting these types of questions, because you both want to balance your belief and your commitment to supporting a woman's right to single-sex basis and they are for very, very important reasons, as we all know, but also recognising that trans people are people who are hugely discriminated against, often incredibly vulnerable people, and this is a clash of rights. But in the end, you have to support single-sex basis for women, but ensure that you have a society where trans people do not suffer discrimination. But it is a clash of rights, and I suspect sometimes in trying to get the balance of that right, sometimes Labour wasn't as clear as it should have been.
Right, well, later in the programme, we're going to be hearing from Maya Forstater, the Sex Matters co-founder, who really, her campaigning work and other people's campaigning work really preceded this Supreme Court ruling. So it's fascinating to hear her story on the ladder at 6:30. Stay tuned. We're going to be talking about Ukraine and what's happening there and the possibility or not of a peace deal with Russia. And we're going to be talking about Katy Perry going to space. So stay tuned for all of that. This is Cathy Newman on Times Radio in association with NatWest Cushion.
Times Radio Market Watch in association with Saxo. Listen to Times Radio throughout the day and hear all the latest financial news from all the global stock markets. Get insight, analysis and up-to-the-minute information to help you get the most from your investment portfolio. Times Radio Market Watch. Throughout the day, every Monday to Friday in association with Saxo. Invest in everything in one place. The simple, low-cost way to invest in your future. Capital at risk.
Download the latest edition of Off Air with Jane Garvey and Fee Glover. Available now on the Times Radio app.
Marking 80 years since victory in Europe, enjoy up to 50% off selected subscriptions at Find My Past. Find your relatives in the 1939 Register, a vast wartime document. Then delve deeper to discover them keeping calm and carrying on. Visit findmypast.co.uk/VE Day and claim up to 50% off today. Your family history understood. Offer ends 21st of April. Terms and conditions apply.
Seconds. That's the difference between life and death. I've seen it firsthand. I'm Javed Abdulmonem, a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières. As conflicts continue to spread across the world, it's crucial we can act fast. As an MSF doctor, I may need to stop life-threatening bleeding, treat gunshot wounds, or care for blast victims, all in a matter of seconds. That's why at Médecins Sans Frontières we don't waste any time. We're working in more conflict zones than you may be aware of, giving everything to give people a chance. Just £30 will keep our life-saving work going. Please help us save more lives. Because with trauma care, every second counts. You can buy us vital time. Please give just £30. Search MSF Doctor or call 0800 055 7979. That's 0800 055 7979. Thank you.
Drive on Times Radio with Cathy Newman.
We are chatting WTF, the week that finished, with former Conservative Cabinet Minister Penny Mordaunt and former Labour frontbencher Jonathan Ashworth. Now, the war in Ukraine has been in the spotlight again this week, with talks between Ukrainian officials and their American and European counterparts taking place in Paris yesterday. It was looking a little bit positive until Secretary of State Marco Rubio had this ominous assessment of the feeling in the White House as he boarded his plane back to the US.
We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about in a matter of days, whether or not this is doable over the next few weeks. If it is, we're in. If it's not, then we have other priorities to focus on as well.
Well, Donald Trump has just started speaking at the White House. Let's hear him. Speaking about Ukraine, I think we should be able to listen in just a moment.
Are you prepared to walk away completely from these efforts and these talks?
Well, I don't want to say that, but
We want to see it end. We want to see it end, yeah.
Is Vladimir Putin stalling, in your view, Mr. President?
I hope not. We're going to let you know about that soon if he is, but I hope not. He's got a big force out there, big force. It's a war that should have never happened. It would have never happened if I was president. That's a war, and it didn't happen for 4 years. That's a war that should have never happened. October 7th, Israel would have never happened. Iran was broke. And now we'll see what happens with Iran. We have a lot of them out there. We have a lot of things that we're working on right now that shouldn't have happened. None of it. Ukraine would have never happened with Russia. October 7th would have never happened, so you wouldn't have had all the problems in the Middle East. The Afghanistan embarrassment, probably the most embarrassing day in the history of our country, would have never happened. Inflation would have never happened. By the way, prices are down.
A very familiar refrain from Donald Trump there. Basically, the world would have been sweetness and light if he had been president all along. But the important point there, Penny Mordaunt, let me put this to you. He's talking about, he was asked whether Vladimir Putin was stalling, and he said he hoped not, and then repeated the claim that the war wouldn't have happened if he'd been in power. This piece looks a bit doomed, doesn't it, Penny?
Well, first of all, Kathy, I'm sorry to see that you've not learnt your lesson and you're still tuning into Donald Trump Live, taking our lives in our hands by doing that. Look, I think it is clearly very difficult. I mean, if the president manages to create the conditions for the war to end, that will be an amazing thing, and he will have delivered on one of his key pledges. But it is very difficult, and we've yet to see him be able to move Putin in any way at all. If that doesn't happen, I think two things will will follow. One is that Europe does step up. It enables Ukraine to carry on, and then pressure is brought to bear from the US, largely by some of the senators that are there. Lindsey Graham, who's looking at financial things that can be done. Senator Wicker, that heads up the Ukrainian caucus in the Senate. They're doing some good things and pushing back on some of the things that the White House is doing. And the conditions are arrived at. Or, and this is my big fear, the US forms an alliance with Russia to keep China in check, and Europe doesn't step up on its defence. It doesn't produce a deterrent or any of the things that Meloni's been asking for, and I hope she's been talking to the president about those things on her recent visit. So,
well Penny, on that very point,
he can do this.
Yeah, Ben Hodges was on the programme earlier, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, and he was fascinating because he basically said it's better that there is no deal immediately now, because he was worried that Trump would force Ukraine into a bad deal. And actually his point was Ukraine and Europe can actually get the upper hand here, and that all that is missing from Europe is self-confidence, and that we have the money to outspend Russia militarily, and we just need the confidence to do that. What do you make of that?
Well, I would agree with that, except I wouldn't call it confidence. I'd call it political will, because ultimately you have to back this with a budget. And in Whitehall at the moment, there is a finished or very near finished defence review that is being sat on. And we suspect it is being sat on because it is calling for upwards of 3%.
Right, well, let's put that to John then.
We've got to do what's necessary.
You've got to do what's necessary. And that is a view that you'll hear my guest in the thick of it at 6:15, Captain Malcolm Farrow. He had a distinguished naval career. He helped liberate the Falkland Islands. He says you've got to be spending more than 2.5%, more than 3%, maybe up to 5% of GDP on defence. And he says you've got to make this happen, raise taxes if necessary. John?
Well, look, I mean, the government does have a long-term commitment to 3%. We do need to increase defence expenditure. There does need to be political will across Europe. We forget that the UK and France are, of course, nuclear powers, and our deterrent is working every day to deter. And I think we need to give ourselves some confidence on that front. But we've got to work across Europe to give our colleagues across Europe the backbone, the strength, the steel to also invest in their defence capability. Look, I would want us to invest in defence more. I think it is the smart way to also reindustrialise our country. But we have also got to be honest. The public finances are shot to pieces. We are not in a good place financially. We're at the absolute limits of what we can borrow as a country because of all kinds of historic reasons which have happened under successive governments. So the question is, where does the money come from?
Well, perhaps some more cuts on welfare is what Captain Malcolm Farrow recommends.
Well, the government's about to cut 5 billion or so from welfare payments. I believe that welfare has to be reformed. I long argued that when I was the shadow welfare secretary. You do need to reform disability benefits and the way in which universal credit wasn't designed to do this, but it's ended up in a position where it essentially locks people out of trying to move into employment. So welfare needs reforming. But look, you've got to be honest. Taking £5 billion out of people's pockets, there's going to be a lot of people worse off. It's not as easy to sort of sit in sort of TV studios and radio studios and just sort of glibly announce, let's get another 10 billion for welfare. That's not how the real world works. We are at absolute limits so you've got to make some tough decisions as to where you're going to find the money if you're going to increase defence. And by the way, I want to increase defence. I do. But I think, the government has got to be honest and realistic with the country on where it's going to find the money from, if it's going to do that, as indeed as the official opposition.
Right. Let's finish this chat with the news that Katy Perry can now quite literally describe herself as an out-of-this-world pop star.
I feel super connected to love. So connected to love. I think this experience has shown me you never know how much love is inside of you, like how much love you have to give, and how loved you are until the day you launch.
Well, there you have it. If you don't know how loved you are, pop up to space for 10 minutes. It's easy. And this is, of course, the story of the Blue Origin mission when an all-female cast blasted off to the edge of space thanks to the funding of billionaire Jeff Bezos. Yeah, well, Penny, I mean, could you sort of celebrate this all-female crew or did you find yourself passing sick bucket?
No, I was very jealous, actually. I'd have loved to have gone up. Would have even donned one of those, what they look like, highly flammable space in order to do so.
Well, you've done the swimsuit, so you know.
I think that we should cut them a bit of slack. I mean, they're not astronauts, but it still, I think, took a bit of guts to do it. It's quite a dangerous pursuit going into space, but I also think that it does change people a bit. I remember talking to a French astronaut about his first experience of going into space, and looking back at our planet with its finite resources in the vastness of space, changed his whole perspective about life and looking after the Earth. So,
what's it called, the overview or something? Something like that, isn't it? When you see how tiny we are.
Yeah, yes, I mean it is a hell of a thing to experience, I'm sure, and I'm very jealous. So if there's a second flight, Jeff, I'm here.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he's tuning in right now. I mean, he's got nothing better to do with his Friday afternoon. John, are you keen to pop up to space? I must admit, I am, but I'm scared of flying.
I would love to go into space. I'm really interested in it. And actually, funnily enough, I think this is a really important debate. We are a leading nation on space, and satellite technology and all of that is going to become an increasingly important factor when we're talking about defence. But here, let me tell you a quick fact before we finish. I'm sat here at home in Leicester. Did you know Leicester University is a leading university on space research? And a piece of equipment that has been designed or made in Leicester has been in space every year since 1967.
Good pub quiz trivia. That's great. But listen, just on I don't want to bring you back down to earth, as it were, but you see what I did there. But, I mean, it's becoming a sort of billionaire's playground, isn't it, space?
Well, I mean, it is, but it's a really important part of our defence.
Yeah, but there was no defence or science justification in that vanity trip.
No. But the important point is this: we're totally reliant on satellite technology, and if satellite technology is disrupted by our enemies, just think about how much would grind to a halt. We might not even be able to have Times Radio playing out live. I mean, this is serious. I mean, we're going to have to think about how we defend our satellite capacity. So, yeah, nations have an interest in this and need to take this area more seriously.
Penny, in 10 seconds, is space becoming a billionaire's playground? Does it matter?
Look, all of these things, air travel, when it was, first invented, the wealthy people are always the first to be able to make use of this.
All right.
But then it becomes more available to other people. I think it should be pushing the boundaries of science and adventure.
Right.
And I reiterate my willingness to...
we got it loud and clear, but we're pushing the boundaries of our time slot here. Penny Mordaunt, John Ashworth, thank you both very much for chatting.